Jim, ready?
Actually, we go. All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm your host for this afternoon for this final colloquium series event of the fall semester under the Program on Education Policy and Governance. I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School. Prior to that, I was Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and it's my privilege to be working alongside Dr. Paul Peterson, who is here today, as well as Dr. Marty West over at the Graduate School of Education. And even though this is our final session of the fall semester, the good news is we're going to pick up where we left off on February 8th, and we'll be having another 10 or 11 sessions this coming spring semester. So hope to see you all in 2024. And this is this is a special occasion, not only because it's our final session, but because our featured speaker is the director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance, Dr. Paul Peterson. And Paul's topic today is important new research that has just been published by Education Next on charter school performance, and specifically comparing state-level charter school performance in or across 35 states, or 36 if you count the District of Columbia, something that has never been done before, which is on the one hand somewhat surprising, but previous studies have focused primarily on comparing student achievement and growth in charter schools relative to their local or district school peers, which studies have tended to show that charter school students tend to outperform their district peers. But there really hasn't been much research, if any, on how charter schools are compared to one another across state lines in terms of student achievement until now. As most of you know, besides heading up the Program on Education Policy and Governance, Dr. Peterson is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard University, where he's been on the faculty since 1988. In addition, Paul is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, which means that he can take advantage of the warm weather in Palo Alto when it turns cold here in Boston like it did today. Unfortunately, you're here, not there, but I'm sure we'll all warm up. After Paul's comments, we should have ample time for questions and answers and discussion. And although we'll give priority to folks who are here in the room, hopefully we do have some folks online, and they're welcome to join the conversation. If for those of you listening in, if you've got a question, please enter it into the chat, and we'll try to incorporate it into the dialogue before we're done. The session is also being recorded, so as a practical matter, we're all on the record here today. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Paul Peterson. Paul.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for coming, and yeah, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. This report came out just before the holiday break, and therefore I thought, well, maybe we should share it with the people here who are interested, since it'll be hard to do so until next February otherwise. So let's put in an extra session and talk about our findings that try to establish for the first time how each state compares to other states in terms of the quality of their charter schools as measured by student performance. So let's see if I can get the screen here to work. So can we get rid of that? Yeah. So our purpose really is policy. This is not really a great research paper. Thank you, Jim, for calling it important. But it's really not a major research paper because it cuts no ground methodologically, and in some ways it's methodologically sort of old-fashioned. So we're offering this more as this is the best we can tell what's going on based on the data that's available to us at this time from official government records. And the only rationale for doing this is that there have been quite a few attempts to compare states and the quality of their charter school. But they have always looked at inputs, like how much money is being spent, or who's the authorizer of the charter schools, or are you allowing for a lot of charter schools or just a few? So there's a lot of organizations out there that are giving charter schools giving states a grade based on what they think is a good charter school policy. But of course, you really want to know what the outcomes are. You don't want to just look at the inputs. You want to look at the outcomes, and then you want to see if there's a connection between inputs and outcomes. So that's sort of what we're going to attempt to do here. But there are lots of challenges. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So this pretty much summarizes what I just said, except for one thing, and that is there is a study out there, which many of you may have heard of, the Credo study at Stanford University, where they have gone around to quite a number of states. I think it's somewhere between 25 and 30 states. And in each of those states, they do compare the charter school performance as measured by student performance on state proficiency tests. And they compare how well the kids are doing as compared to schools in the neighborhood. So if you say every charter school has a neighborhood, well, we'll compare the performance of the students at the school, at the charter school, that of the students in the neighborhood, and we'll try to identify people at the neighborhood schools that are as similar to the charter school students as we can detect using, standard demographic characteristics and prior test scores, and we'll come up with a guess as to whether or not the charter school is better than those schools. But anytime you do that, you're actually measuring two things. You're measuring the public school with which the charter school is being compared and the charter school itself. So it doesn't give you a clean measure of how well the charter school is doing. It's giving you a relative measure. How well is the charter school doing as compared to what is available in the neighborhood? Now, that may be I'm not saying it's not a perfectly valid thing to do. There's a good case to be made for that kind of investigation. But our claim is we also would like to know which charter schools are the best in the United States, or at least which states have the best charter schools in the United States, based on what we know about student performance. And that we really don't have very good information about until now. So this is to put a few numbers on what I just said. These are some of the groups out there. I won't go into it in any great detail, but these are some of the groups out there that have come up with their own rankings of states based on what they think charter school system should look like. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is the best known organization out there. There's also the Center for Education Reform, which has also been making lots of recommendations with respect to charter policy. There's Ed Choice, which looks at school choice more generally. The Heritage Foundation has come up with things, and there's something called the Education Freedom Institute. All these groups have come up with their own measures, and they're usually indexes of a lot of characteristics of the state landscape. And so now I think that basically the correlations among these variables are fairly weak. If you look down the column 1, that sort of gives you the best indication of how they connect. But you can look at the whole display there. And then I put in red what we're going to be showing today. So this is how well these ranking systems are doing as compared to what we think is the real story, that is to say, the outcomes. And you can see that those coefficients in red are very tiny, right? So in other words, a lot of what interest groups have been saying makes for a good charter school system in a state doesn't seem to show much correlation with actually what happens in a state. The best one is the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. But even that has a correlation of 0.19. So I guess there is another 0.19 up there. So if you get an 0.19 correlation in your data set, you sort of go on, right? You don't sort of spend a lot of time thinking, oh, I found the real cause here. So this leads, so that's our first conclusion, is to be a little skeptical of some of the rankings these interest groups have come up with. So now what we have is a ranking based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress of the nation's report card, which I'm sure many of you in the room have already heard of. Now, we can't do this on a year-by-year basis. We have to summarize it for an 11-year period from 2009 to 2019, because we don't get enough observations of charter school students in particular states if you just look at one test or two tests. So we are relying upon 24 different administrations over this 11-year period, some in math, some in reading, some in 4th grade, some in 8th grade. So there's there are 24 national administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress to either 4th graders or 8th graders in either reading or math. And so we're taking all of that together. So this is a summary measure that covers both math and reading. If you break it out between reading and math, we don't get any difference. The summary is more precise. It's better material to work with. But if you were to break this all out by reading and math, you wouldn't get much difference. So we show that in the paper that we published. So altogether, that gives us 150,000, not quite, but close to 150,000 observations of charter school performances over this period of time, which is enough to, give you pretty good numbers for each state that we have a sizable charter sector. And what's really nice about the NAEP is that it's nationally representative and it's representative for each state. So we have a sample here that's representative, state representative. So the sample tells you what's going on within the state, and it also is nationally representative. So, and it's the same test. That's the other important thing that I'd like to emphasize here, is that we're working with one test administered nationwide. Of course, it changes a little bit from each administration of the test, but NAEP tries to make all these tests comparable to one another over time. So the 2009 test isn't going to look a lot different from the 2019 test. It's been sort of organized in such a way that you can assume that you're getting equivalent results, even though the questions are somewhat different. And I'm not a psychometrician, but the people at NAEP, are you on the NAEP governing board?
I am not yet.
Well, Marty West is, and so we trust Marty West. He's on the board and he doesn't hire these people, but he knows perfectly well that you have some of the best psychometricians in the country who are very good at designing tests that have equivalence over time. So, the other important thing to keep in mind is that we are taking into account the student's background, and we have a number of background characteristics that we take into account. We have student ethnicity, gender, free and reduced lunch status, where they live, whether it's a city, suburb, rural area, whether or not they're eligible for special education, whether they're an English language learner, their age at the time of testing, whether there was a computer available in the home, the number of books in the home, and we have the students report of their parents' education if they're 8th graders. So for that particular variable, we have it only for the 8th graders. Then we sort of standardize everything with the use of subject year and grade fixed effects, because we've got reading and math, we got 4th and 8th grade. We have these different years, but to put it all on a common metric, then we use a fixed effects for all of these characteristics or all these variables. So we're going to compare everything to the median performance. No, it's the mean performance nationwide. So if the numbers that you will see are going to be the differences between this state and the national average. So if it's a plus, they can sort of pat themselves on the back maybe, and if it's a minus, they are going to be a little cross with us probably for not getting it right. So if they're at the very top, then that means that they're doing a lot better than any other state, or at least somewhat better than any other state. And just to give you a sense of how the magnitude of each finding, a difference of 0.3 is roughly the same as a year's worth of learning. Now we know that because we know that an 8th grader who takes the 4th grade test will score on that test 1.2 standard deviations higher than the 8th grader will score 1.2 standard deviations higher than the 4th grader. So dividing by 4, that gives us 0.3. So we're saying you're going to gain from one year to the next if your average 0.3 standard deviation. So that's quite a bit. So one standard deviation difference is 4 years difference, or 1.2 standard deviation is 4 years difference, and if 0.3 is a 1 year difference. So and we will see that there's huge variation among the states when you take that into account. There's lots of years of learning that differentiates things. What should I do now?
Is that the right one?
There we go. And so this is the story. And I hope you can read it. It's not the best. You can see that Alaska is the surprise winner. So that I would say is our number one surprise in this. If I had asked you who was the state that came out on top, you would not have said Alaska, I would imagine, unless you've read this study somewhere or the results of this study. So Alaska takes the prize, and it does so fairly clearly. I tried to say, oh, it's just sort of tied with some of the other top states, but it isn't. It's clearly out in front. Now it has a fairly small charter sector, so you might say, okay, that's something funny about what they're doing in their charter schools there. But I had the privilege of talking to the Commissioner of Education for the state of Alaska. And you have to listen to my podcast. Because actually, for the first time in my entire lifetime of interviewing people on my podcast, I've interviewed now for 4 or 5 years every week. So I've talked to a lot of people on these podcasts. For the first time, I actually talked to somebody who cried on the podcast, and it was the right time to cry. I asked her the question. I said, is it true in Alaska that the kids have lost a lot of learning and they're socially isolated and emotionally distressed as a result of the pandemic and closing of the schools? And she I don't know why she broke down. I mean, we all know that this is the case, but it was really distressing. I felt like, that's part of the story in Alaska. The people in Alaska really care about their children's education. And she was the head superintendent for Anchorage, Alaska. She'd been a teacher in the system. She'd come up through the system. And somehow she, to me, personifies the integrity of the Alaska educational system. So, I want to sort of say hurrah for Alaska there. But then there's Colorado and Massachusetts, which doesn't come as that big a surprise. New Hampshire is a bit of a surprise. New York, Oklahoma, New Jersey, Florida, all those are fairly well-known names in the charter school business. And if you go down to the bottom, we probably heard before that Michigan is not the best place for charter schools. I certainly, Detroit charter schools don't get a lot of applause. Tennessee is a little, it's not particularly surprising, but I wouldn't have guessed that would be way down there. Hawaii is a state where charters are basically serving the indigenous population, and even though we control for background characteristics, they're trying to teach the Hawaiian language in charter schools rather than the English language. So that might, and they probably don't pay much attention to test score performance. That's not really what they're about, probably in Hawaii. So those are some of those that are at the extremes of the distribution. So these are sort of what I just said, the expected results and some of the surprising results are here. California is way down the list. And charter schools in California have had a pretty good reputation, but they don't show up well when you compare them to others nationwide. So the regional pattern that we see is sort of the Northeast looks good. The South looks surprisingly well relative to the country as a whole, a little above average. And the Midwest doesn't look so good. And the Pacific Coast doesn't look so good. So that's sort of a rough generalization. It doesn't apply. Connecticut is not as up there in the same place as New Hampshire, for example. So it's not 100% true, but roughly speaking, that's the regional pattern we observe. And what we observe for students in general tends to be what we observe for specific subgroups of students. So it's not like, okay, you have, overall, Alaska's first, but it's in Massachusetts, Colorado, or second and third. But when you get into who's teaching Black students well, who's teaching free and reduced lunch students well, so you go down this column here, number one, and the overall category is number one, and then the subgroup categories can be compared to the overall category by just going down that column. And you'll see there's lots of 0.9s, which means the two variables are very highly correlated with one another. The exceptions are the Hispanic pattern is 0.77, which is close to 0.8. It's not quite as tight as the Black pattern with the overall pattern, but it's not that much different either. So I would say that in summary, if I wanted to put it in a bumper sticker, what's true in general is true for the subgroups. So you can find some exceptions to that, but that's what I would say. Cheryl, we can probe into that more if you want to. But we did look at the gap between the performance in charter schools of white and Black students. And we do see that states vary quite a bit in this regard. This is the difference. So 0.53 difference is like nearly 2 years worth of learning between the white and Black students at charter schools in Oklahoma, which is really, dreadful, but still the best as compared to all the states. And if you go down the list, where are we? I can see, if we go to BC, it's 1 is nearly 4 years worth of learning, 117.5. That's nearly 1.2. It's nearly 4 years worth of learning. So it varies from, say, about 2 years to about 4 years worth of learning difference between blacks and whites. So in some states, the differences are twice as big as in the other states. But that's at the extreme. So there's a lot of variation there. And the states that show well on this are Oklahoma, Arizona, New York, Florida, Illinois, Colorado. Whereas Massachusetts? Massachusetts is, you know, it's still in the upper tiers, but it's not something that they can particularly brag about. And then we did the same for Hispanic students.
Oh, sorry. Just a second. Here we go.
Well, I missed the Hispanic.
There you go.
students. Okay, so the Hispanic students, these differences are less. Hispanic performance is at charter schools is not as differentiated from white performance. In Oklahoma, which once again comes out looking very, overall, Oklahoma is a big winner on this because their overall performance is fairly high and the black, white, black, Hispanic gaps are small. And here it's about, you know, a little over a year's worth of difference. Instead of 2 years for blacks, it's 1 year for Hispanics. And then that will go as high as in the District of Columbia, which is again at the bottom. The difference is just short of 4 years worth of learning, say 3.5 years worth of learning. So it's maybe 3 years, a little over 3 years worth of learning. So it's very serious. It's a lot of variation and big overall, but not as big as the black white difference. So here is a comparison. How do charter schools compare to public schools in general on the NAEP over the same time period? Well, it turns out that the Urban Institute has done almost exactly the same thing that we did for charter schools for all public schools. We didn't take their methodology. We didn't try to match a methodology. We found out about their study after we had completed ours. But we ended up doing almost exactly the same thing. It's probably not an accident because Matthew Chingos was here as a postdoctoral fellow, and we talked a lot about the best way of doing these things when he was here. And so he's gone on and built his own organization at the Urban Institute and does very terrific work down there. So I said, well, gee, let's see how Matt Chingos's study comes out compared to ours, because he's looking at all the public schools in the state, including the charters, but you know, primarily the district schools, which are over 90% of all students. And he shows that, if we match them together, you can see that these dots are scattered all over the place. So if a charter school did just, if you could predict how a charter school is doing simply by knowing how public schools in general are doing in the state, then all these dots would be on the line, on that regression line there, that red dotted line. That red dotted line would be going from this corner up to that corner, and that would be the diagonal 45-degree angle. That would show you that the two things are the same thing. So if they were exactly the same thing, then all those dots would be on that line, and it would be a 45-degree increment. So you can see it's not that at all. Instead, those dots are scattered all over the place. There is some relationship because that red dotted line is angling up, which means there's a positive relationship. It's about 0.3, just short of 0.3. So there's something there, but it's by no means the whole story. So for example, let's see, Pennsylvania down there is doing quite well. It's ranked number 10 among all public schools, but it's towards the bottom. The charter schools in Pennsylvania are down towards the bottom. So Pennsylvania over here, if I can put the, oh, this thing isn't good for me. Light.
Pennsylvania's right here.
Oh, there you have it. So Pennsylvania is an example of pretty good public schools, but pretty bad charter schools. And then you get the opposite of that in Alaska. You know, Alaska's charter schools are doing a lot better than public schools. Massachusetts looks pretty good, right? Because Massachusetts has got the best public schools in the country and has got almost the best charter schools. It's in third place on the charter schools thing. So Massachusetts, you can, the same is true for New Jersey and Florida. And then back down at the other end, we have Michigan, Tennessee, and Hawaii. Low ranking on both the public schools. Now, once again, I want to say, the Chinga study at the Urban Institute controls for the same background characteristics that we do. So all of this is controlling for the background demographic characteristics of the student. So this is trying to get at schools, how schools do with more or less equivalent students based on their demographic characteristics. So where here? Oh, yes, let's talk about the Credo study, which I mentioned at the beginning. And this little PowerPoint slide says that Credo compares charter schools to district schools, and they do so on the basis of the state, each state's proficiency test. And we're using the NAEP. And we're comparing everybody on that NAEP test. So we tend to think that on the whole, we like our data better than the data that they work with. Because if you're working with state tests, they have different tests in every single state. And so you've got to put them on some kind of a common platform to make comparisons across states. Can you do that? Well, it's being done. Lots of people are doing that. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but you got to make a lot of assumptions when you make that. So it's a lot cleaner if you have take one test that's administered nationally and you see how do students compare on that test. The second thing about NAEP that makes it really an attractive test is that it's a test that is a low stakes test. And nobody knows who's taking the test. No teacher is going to be evaluated on the basis of it. No school district is, no school is, no principal is. In fact, not even the state is going to know this. This sort of has now creeped out, but you know, NAEP itself is not reporting charter school performance out by state level. So you have to go in there and dig it out. It's buried in the data. So, so the incentives to cheat or to manipulate the performance of kids on the test by feeding them breakfast in the morning and, you know, sort of a good English breakfast instead of a not so good French breakfast or something like that. You can actually you know, people have said that there's a lot of manipulation of the performance on the state proficiency test, but nobody actually makes those claims for the NAEP test. So I would say that you're getting a cleaner measure our way, but mostly we're just measuring different things. They're comparing. So if you have a halfway decent charter school that's next to terrible public schools, the charter school is going to look pretty good. So if it's in a neighborhood where you got terrible public schools, the charter school is going to be looking pretty good, even though it's really not that great. At the same time, if a charter school is in a suburban area, say where public schools are pretty solid, The charter school might be doing halfway decent job, but it might not look that great. Might not look like it's even keeping up with the neighborhood school. So it's a comparison. So by putting everybody on the same scale nationwide, I think at least we get something different. I'm not saying Credo doesn't have a point to it, but having this measure is all. So this is what Credo gets, and I wish I had the two on the same slide so you could see directly, but you can see that the rank order that you get among the states and the Credo is Rhode Island, New York, Missouri, Illinois, Massachusetts is down the list a little ways. Tennessee goes way up towards the top of the list. Maryland, New Jersey, Michigan goes way up on the list. So, you know, there's quite a different. Florida is way down on this list here. Although Pennsylvania is low on both their list and our list. So I'll just put the Pepsi one up as well. Just to remind you, Alaska, Massachusetts, Colorado, New York, Oklahoma, New Jersey. So the two lists are somewhat there. We can go into more of that if any of you have a specific question about that. But so the basic point we're making here is that you're learning something different from this kind of comparison than from the Credo one. And so a lot is the question that you want an answer to as to which of these two sets of comparisons you would like to have. But I probably talked long enough, Jim, because I'm sure people will have some questions about what's been done here.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. And I apologize for calling it important research. I won't do that again, but it's nonetheless an important paper. So thank you for that. Why don't I kick it off with a question, but then we'll open it up for anyone to follow up. So one of the, I don't know, troubling or discouraging parts of the research is the way in which the sort of correlation between the findings and what other people have put out, like the National Association of Public Charter Schools around ranking the quality of charter school laws, has sort of done in terms of their own rankings. And so, you know, the highest quality environments, policy environments don't necessarily lead to the highest quality charter school outcomes. And similarly, obviously, as we were just talking about, the alignment or the correlation between overall performance in the state and the charter school sector are also not, you know, not very strong. So not to say, well, why, you know, what is it that's driving it? But could it be that, especially in terms of these sort of correlations with other factors, that the mix of charter schools in particular states is just for reasons that may have nothing to do with the policy environment or the overall educational environment in the state, just kind of be random, a little bit random. So whether it's the number of charter management organizations or the number of schools that are of a certain sort of curricular focus or thematic focus, that they just happen to show up in places that depend on who just happens to be starting charter schools in those states. Anyway, all that's to say is there something more about the charter operators themselves than the sort of environment in which they're in which they exist?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and we do have some answers to this question that I probably should have mentioned, but this gives me an opportunity to bring that out. And probably the most interesting thing that we've come up with is that what you did at the State Department of Education in Massachusetts was the right thing. You should be very pleased
that's why I asked this question, obviously.
That turns out that way, because if the authorizer is a state agency, as it is in Massachusetts, the State Board of Education, the students at those types of charter schools authorized under that kind of regime are doing clearly better than other students, no matter any other authorizer. And the worst authorizer to have, I hesitate to say here at Harvard University, is to have a university as your authorizer. Universities are the worst authorizers out there. Now, I don't know exactly why, or I shouldn't say that for sure, because all I can say for sure is that the students learn the least if they attend a charter school that was authorized by a university. Now, Massachusetts doesn't allow Harvard to authorize charter schools. That's probably a very good thing. I wouldn't recommend that you change that policy, Jim, or your successors do that, because what we're showing and there are lots of states that do have universities as the authorizer of charter schools, or as one of the authorizers of charter schools, and those do particularly badly. The mayor's office is not very good either. The mayor's office authorizes charter schools in some states. The school district is the authorizer of many charter schools. About half the charter schools in the United States are authorized by school district. And they're not as good as state agencies, but they're not bad. They're sort of halfway between the university and the state. So who the authorizer is generally makes a difference. And the state authorizer, it doesn't get enough credit. I think that they tend to take their job more responsibly. And my interpretation of that is, well, they've been worried about the quality of education in their state for a very long period of time, and they're supposed to oversee things like that. And so they're really doing in the charter sector what they traditionally have supposedly been doing in the district sector for a very long period of time. So it's not surprising that the state agency is pretty good at this. So that's one finding. The other finding is the more specialized the charter school, the better it is. So that is to say, students learn more if they go to a charter school that has a specialized focus. Some scholars have come up, they've scraped every website that's put out there by a charter school. And some charter school websites say it's our purpose to have bilingual instruction, or STEM, or arts, or there's any number of, there's 25 different types of specializations in terms of pedagogy and their curriculum and type of students being served. And so the more specific they define their focus, the higher the average performance of students attending that kind of a charter school. So to me, that's the message that comes in from that, is that a well-defined mission produces a good school. And if a charter school says, well, we're just there to serve everybody, whoever, all are welcome, come in, we can take care of you, we can meet the needs of everybody, that turns out not to be, the students at such schools turn out to be performing at a lower level. So that's two things. The other thing we found is funding doesn't make any difference. Now, charter school people are not going to like this finding, but we can't find any relationship with the amount of money that a charter school is receiving and the amount of and the level of student performance. So that's a little bit at this point less than conclusive evidence, and I think that's something for us to work on to get better quality data than we currently have to see if that's a durable finding. But it doesn't look like money makes that much difference. So that's three of there's a couple more that may occur to me. That's three kinds of things that we've found and about what makes for a good higher level of student performance.
I think one of them might have been charter management organizations or networks.
Oh, yeah,
charter
that's true.
schools, too.
Yeah, charter schools that are part of a network, if it's a nonprofit network.
Yep.
Those students learn more in that context than they do at these standalone mom and pop charter schools, and or if it's a for-profit. The for-profit schools could be the lowest group, but they're not statistically different, significantly different from that of the standalone charters. So, but those in the nonprofit networks stand out as quite a bit better. Definitely better than the others.
By the way, one quick follow-up on the single authorizer is that like the ratings or the rankings of the Charter School Association or NACSA, the Association of Charter School Authorizers, will always provide extra value or extra points for states that have multiple authorizers because of the fear that the single authorizer might at some point turn against, if you will, charter schools and just shut down the whole thing. So there's this interesting tension between rigorous, if that's the right word, authorizing practices and a little bit more flexibility or openness to make sure that the charter sector
We
doesn't.
did
become
look
victims.
at the number of authorizers in a state, and that turned out not to be significant.
Yeah. Any questions? Yes.
My name is Saif. I'm from the education school. My question is, I'm still struck by the disparity between the outliers, Alaska and Hawaii. And you mentioned that one of the reasons was that in Hawaii, children are being taught in indigenous languages. My question was, is that not being done in Alaska as well? And what explains the good performance in Alaska?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't know if there is many, I don't know the Alaska story as well as I know the Hawaii story. I happened to go to Hawaii last spring before I knew these results, and I did some visiting of charter schools in Hawaii just out of interest as to see what they were doing there. And I discovered that about half of the schools in Hawaii were providing instruction in the Hawaiian language. Now, the Hawaiian language is nearly a dead language in Hawaii. Most people in Hawaii speak English, no matter whether they're Japanese or Filipino or Hawaiian or whatever. And so the instruction in the Hawaiian language is to preserve the language, because there's been since the Hawaiian Renaissance, there's been a concern that some of the customs of the people are disappearing, and the language is the best way of preserving the customs. So charter schools have been developed to preserve the traditions of the Hawaiian people. And I don't know that, learning English, which is what these exams are testing, is really what those charter schools are about. Now, there are quite a number of charter schools that are providing instruction in English, but most of them are also interested in preserving traditional Hawaiian culture in one way or another, but are doing it through the English language rather than through the. So I actually became very sympathetic to what they were doing in Hawaii. So, but if it doesn't look good when you do it with this kind of an analysis. Now in Alaska, a lot of the Alaskan schools are, Alaska's had correspondence schools since the 1930s, and they have been used to creating programs that are distant learning programs. You would, send out materials to read, and then you would write answers, and then you would get feedback from the central office or whatever. So they have many different forms of educational provision for a much longer period of time than most states. So, but the thing that really struck me with my conversation with the superintendent in Alaska is the good relationship that exists between the charter schools and the public schools. She said there really is not any significant conflict. The charter school teachers go to the meetings that are held in the state or the district, and she was also the superintendent of the biggest school district in the state. So she's talking about her experience both in that role and in her current role. That there's just it's not a big issue in Alaska whether or not you go to a charter school or a district school. There's not that tension that you find in so many other places. So I don't know the full story of Alaska. I think it would be a great project for somebody to explore.
It might be more fun to do the research in Hawaii, though. Maybe, I don't know. Depends on the season.
No. Alaska's a wonderful thing.
Thank you so much. This was very informative. I'm very curious about the case of California, having lived there for my undergrad. Going back to how the students were assessed, I find it very interesting that, their ability to read English is such a poor component that makes up the test scores and where the schools fell. And California has a very high immigrant population. The parents, who are don't know English, and they're sending their kids to schools, right? So it affects their learning. So using the case of California, I'm curious if you were to design a more holistic way of evaluating students, like what other markers would you place to see that the students are moving through the system, even if they're not, being very proficient in English? Like, what are other ways we can assess that they are growing and doing okay in school?
Okay, so there's two parts to that question. One is, should we look at things other than test scores when we do these interstate comparisons? And I definitely think we should. I mean, it's just that it's very hard to do that, given the data that's currently available. But looking at absenteeism rates right now is certainly something to look at, looking at suspension rates, looking at all kinds of any data that we can have on behavioral characteristics of individuals at the schools. Social and emotional learning is an area where people are trying to develop measures to see whether or not students are acquiring skills in that dimension, which I think is really a great idea. So yes, I do think that you can have other kinds of measures besides test scores. It's just that test scores is the one thing that has been developed. Now, test scores tend to be highly correlated with these other measures. So if you have high test score performance in a school, you're probably going to have pretty good looking indicators on these other characteristics as well. So that's one thing. The other thing you should remember is that Florida has every bit as many Hispanic students as California. And I don't want to anticipate the debate tonight. Is there a debate tonight? This is not said in any political context at all. Other than that, Florida has been a leader of education reform for a very long period of time, and it was led especially by Jeb Bush, who was himself married to a Mexican American, and who himself speaks both languages very well, and who was very committed to improving the quality of instruction in Florida among the Hispanic population. And the Hispanic performance in Florida is higher than the average performance of all students in California. So, it's not just that California has an Hispanic population that puts Florida at the bottom of the list, or well down the list in both the charter and the public school performances. And Florida is pretty far up the list on both of them. Given that, and it's quite extraordinary because, Florida has the legacy of slavery and segregation, and there's so much to overcome in Florida that California didn't have to overcome. And so for California schools to be where they are is really an embarrassment, given the wealth of that state.
I'm particularly struck by the racial disparities. I'm wondering if you compare those to the racial disparities of the general population to see if there are states where charter schools are either closing the racial achievement gap or actually exacerbating it.
Yeah, well, that could be easily done by simply looking at that with the data that Chingos has for public schools in general and comparing it to charter schools. That's a really useful suggestion. We haven't done that, but just as we've done it for average performances, we could do it for the disparities to see if the disparity closing is equivalent in the charter sector and in the non-charter sector. Yeah, we could probably do that within an afternoon. Yeah, so thank you for that question. Good question. Yeah.
Oh, if I can get you to focus on the Hispanic outcomes for a second. Hispanics is a big and kind of disparate category. Have you broken that down in any ways that would be of any interest?
We are a prisoner of the United States government.
Yeah,
And they lumped together a vast
I know.
people of enormous differences into one big fat category.
Yeah.
And so, no, we can't do that with these data, but you're quite right. And of course, in Florida, you do have the migration from Cuba is a very different migration than the one from Mexico. And so therefore, maybe you should be making comparisons between Texas and California instead of Florida and California. Texas is about halfway between California and Florida. Physically and in all other respects. So, the story is a lot more positive for Texas, as you know, Peter,
Yeah.
than it is for California and for the Hispanic population, though it isn't quite the same as Florida.
A question on technology. What is the challenge that districts and schools face in adopting technology? And what role or how good of a job, what should they do different in the private sector that are developing these technologies?
Well, that's a little bit beyond my ken, so I think I will sort of say there's a lot that be done in that space, but I don't have any particular. There's nothing in these data that allow me to speak to that question. The only thing that we don't know is that all the learning online that took place during the pandemic seemed to have fallen well short of what had been occurring prior to the pandemic. And so whatever we were doing online was not the best use of technology. That's the only thing I think I could say with some confidence.
Are there any, was there any way you could break out the data by virtual charter schools versus in-person ones?
That's a good question. The NAEP does not collect data on virtual schooling. So all this is brick and mortar schools. Yep.
Thank you for this presentation and thank you for walking us through so clearly what the controls were and what the what like those standard deviations meant, because otherwise we would probably really, what does this mean? So thank you for that. Really, thank you for also doing those controls, looking at like number of books in the home, the levels of parent education. I could definitely see somebody saying like, well, they're low income, but their parents have high education. So I think that's like a really, really interesting. I hadn't seen that before in a control. So my question is, you said there was like a strong correlation between the authorizer being the state board, the outcomes are the best. As states, I think there's some states, I heard California is changing it, so it's only going to be the state board would be the only authorizer. And there might be others that are switching to that. Do you think there's going to be a big shift in some of these rankings? If some states might move up the ranking as they get rid of all the local authorizers, or do you think that's not really a trend that you're seeing anyway?
Yeah, probably if this paper has an impact, it will be in an increase in the use of state boards of education or the state agency as the authorizer. And whether or not that will have an effect, my prediction is it would have a positive effect, but we would have to wait and see. But I do think that people are going to wonder why we don't go. It's sort of a natural thing to do anyhow. And all these other inventions that have come up. You could look at it, this whole charter sector has been a domain in which we've been experimenting, trying different things. And one of the things we did try was who should authorize charters. We've got a lot of different models out there. And I think we're now getting some information that suggests that, give more authority to the state. And the state ultimately decides this. So the state can easily assume this role if it wants to. It just has to persuade the legislature to let them do that.
Thank you.
Somebody had their hand up. Sure.
Thank you so much, Professor Peterson. You mentioned earlier that the Credo study and the PEPG study answer two very different questions. One focuses on state by state, specifically for charter, and Credo focuses on public versus charter. As a policy student here at the Kennedy School, there seems to be a pressure to focus on certain sectors of reform. So given the PEPG's focus on charter schools state by state, do you think that education policy reform over the next 5 to 10 years should be focusing more on improving charter performance over public school performance or traditional public school performance?
Well, my view is, on that, I've held this view for a long time, is that parents should have choice in education, that is the best way to strengthen our educational system. That the attempt to provide the same educational services to everybody, regardless of location, through a system where the government hires the people who provide the service hasn't really worked very well. It's really, the performance of our educational system is way below what it should be and below that of many other countries. And although you can see some improvement in our students' performances over the years, it's hard to, it could be for reasons that have little to do with the quality of the schooling improving. So I am very much in favor of giving parents choice, and one of the choices out there that I think they should have is charter schools. Charter schools are now serving about 7% of the population. I think it would be good public policy to increase that percentage by double that percentage in the next 10 years. Yes, easily, I could recommend that.
We have any online questions? Someone related to quality of teaching. I don't know if that,
Yeah, how do you factor in the quality of teaching, both teacher prep and quality of instruction? In these rankings, I guess.
Let's see, say that once more.
How do you factor in quality of teaching, both teacher prep and quality of instruction?
Well, the question is once you control these background characteristics, and we see this variation among the states, what does explain the ranking of the states in the charter sector? And one candidate is the quality of the teachers. Are the teachers actually of higher quality in Alaska and in Massachusetts, in Colorado, and New York, and New Jersey, and Florida than elsewhere? Yeah, I think they are. Now, they are for a wide variety of reasons. The concentration of talent in the United States is in the Northeast and on the East Coast. But it's also, there's a lot of talent on the West Coast. And so the sad part of this story is, given the talent that's concentrated on the West Coast, why isn't the educational system able to attract that talent into the teaching force? So I think the quality of it. So is it teacher preparation, or is it the general population from which you're attracting teachers? Who knows? But we don't, teacher preparation programs are not, Harvard has a wonderful one, right? I stipulate that, and I actually believe that to be the case, but I don't think that in general, teacher preparation programs at our universities are very good. I think they are not preparing people adequately for what they're going to face in the classroom. They're not providing enough hands-on experience. It's too much textbook experience. So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done to improve the quality of teacher preparation.
If I can add my own comment, it doesn't explain the gaps between public school, like on that one chart, the gaps between public school, traditional district public schools and charters in certain states.
That's
In
right.
Massachusetts, when they're
Right.
closer together, sure, but
Yes, but it doesn't in the case of Oklahoma, for example. Oklahoma, the charter schools are looking amazingly good, and I don't have a very good explanation, because you wouldn't expect that given the quality of the public school system in Oklahoma generally.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit maybe about what further research might be useful as a follow-on to this, or what other topics or issues might be worth exploring in light of the findings. And then maybe similarly, given the fact that you had to aggregate 10 years of data in order to get enough data to sort of make your findings, how do you think about kind of carrying this particular analysis forward to provide, further indication about what's changing or happening in the overall charter marketplace?
Well, it's going to take a while before we have enough observations from the NAEP, unless NAEP expands its testing, and NAEP could expand its testing in the charter sector. All it would have to do is to make sure it tests a higher density of students. It already does that. So, for example, it tests the same number of students in schools in general in the state of Montana as it does in California, right? So, because we need a lot of observations in order to do this kind of an analysis, and so NAEP actually has adapted to that. So to have state representative samples from all 50 states, some states they have to talk to a higher proportion of the students. Well, you could do the same thing with the charter sector. If you really want to know how the charter sector is doing compared to one state to another, or the district schools and the public schools, all you have to do is higher density. In the charter sector, it wouldn't be ridiculously expensive to do a lot more than we're currently doing. So hopefully that idea will percolate up to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and we'll be able to come up with something without waiting for another decade and a half.
By the way, so the urban program, TUDA, I think it's called. I don't know if that's how they.
That's right. Looking at
Do they look at charter? Do they assess charter students in those cities that participate?
they have had an unstable set of policies, but I think they're coming around to doing that. So
Is it
yes.
possible that might be
So
a
you
vehicle
could-
as
you
well,
could
not at
work
a
with
state
it.
level, but
That is worth exploring. Yeah.
but in terms of sort of following up on some of these questions, like a single authorizer or the type of charter school, are there other sort of follow-on areas of exploration you think would be worth pursuing?
Well, there's lots of topics there, but we're still recovering from all of the work that we put this one through.
I mean, for other people to do, not for you to do. Any final questions?
Right behind.
Oh, there
I
we
have
go.
a second one, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Paul, if I could, you have to press on what I thought this young person's question was about, but I'll take ownership of the question. In terms of the dynamic between charter schools and public schools, conventional public schools. In your answer to that question that you posed, I thought you were going to say that something like the charter schools as well as public schools should be improved. So I guess what I'm asking you is, how do you see the bigger picture? Are charter schools and then their improvements going to provide competition to public schools that will then cause them to become better? Or do we need to also focus on public schools as a separate problem that need to be reformed as well? In other words, how do you see the interaction of these two sectors in the bigger picture of public education?
Well, the easy answer is to say, yes, we should be improving education for all students, and I would certainly not
Give me
disagree with that. No, I wouldn't argue ever against making as many improvements in both the charter and the district sectors as possible. But if you're thinking about, what is the future of the charter sector? Should you be encouraged? Do these data lead you to wanting to encourage growth in the charter sector? Well, it doesn't really speak to that, because we're really saying, well, how do states improve, look compared to one another? And so from these data alone, you can't say should the charter sector be encouraged to expand. But we've looked at other data in a previous study. We are showing that the charter school sector is improving at a substantially faster rate than the district sector. The district sector hasn't improved much at all in the recent years. In fact, of course, all sectors have had a serious setback with the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, the district sector was not improving, but the charter sector was. So you would, given that, you certainly would not want to discourage growth in the charter sector.
Yeah. But if I can, if the idea is giving families choices, part of making choices would be paying attention to public schools as well. I mean, I understand the resource inequity here, but I mean, choice would mean making public schools a more serious choice for many families.
Well, if you think money is going to help you achieve that, yes, you could advocate that. You could, if you want to do that.
Okay, I'm not sure I want to, but I'm wondering what you wanted to do.
I think we're, maybe one last question and we'll wrap up.
A question about this. So this is all based on me. And I know PISA is changing their tests a lot right now. Has the NAEP test been constant? Have there been any changes in that? And are there any, somebody had asked about going forward, are there any changes being planned?
Well, I don't know about the future, but I do know that the NAEPs, the main NAEP, there's two types of NAEPs, and we're using the main NAEP here. And the main NAEP got started in 1990, and from 1990 to 2000, it's sort of unstable. They were tinkering around with it quite a bit. Since 2000, it's been pretty standardized. So what they were doing then. Now, there always has to be updating of questions. But when they update the questions to the current curriculum, they try to do it in such a way as to preserve the comparability of the test over time. So, that's what, if you go to the University of Iowa or Iowa State University more exactly, but either one of them, you can get a degree in how to construct tests. And there's it's a PhD program, and it's a very sophisticated program. And there's a lot of theory that goes into designing the tests that are to make them comparable over time and across grade levels and so forth. It's a very complicated, sophisticated field. And NAEP employs the people who have the top level training in that area. And they rely a lot heavily on Education Testing Service, ETS, which is, the dominant company in the industry. So, I'm not too worried about the fact that the tests are changing appropriately over time, as long as they are making considerable efforts to make sure that the data that we come up with is comparable over time. However, having said that, we use fixed effects analysis to adjust for any changes in the overall performance of students over time, nationally, due to improving nationwide growth or decline in student performance, and also to correct for any differences in the tests from one year to the next. So the fixed effects analysis adjusts for that particular potential problem.
So maybe we should have one of our colloquium sessions next year in Iowa, and we can quiz those folks more directly. But thank you for your question.
We could bring an ETS expert.
We could probably bring them in too. Yes, that's a good point. So with that, I think we're done. Paul, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and see you in 2024.